accent. Beautiful.
Thank you, thank you. I appreciate that. I love it as well. And I gotta say,
Thank you both.
I've got my top list.
Some risks look reckless only because their purpose isn't obvious at the time. On paper, this one made very little sense. A closed set, an unfinished script, a director known for absolute control, long shooting days that stretched into years, and a story built around discomfort rather than spectacle. There were easier choices available, safer projects, roles that would reinforce an already untouchable image. But this wasn't about reinforcement, it was about exposure. The film didn't promise heroism or clarity, it offered ambiguity, psychological vulnerability, a narrative that stripped away certainty instead of rewarding it. For a global star whose career depended on precision and control, stepping into that space carried real consequences. The gamble wasn't physical, it was reputational. Working under conditions where nothing was rushed, nothing was explained, and nothing was guaranteed meant surrendering a level of authority most actors at that level never give up. Every delay raised questions. Every rumor magnified pressure. Every creative decision felt like a test. For Tom Cruise, Eyes Wide Shut wasn't just another role. It was a choice to step into uncertainty, knowing that if it failed, there would be nowhere to hide. And that is exactly why the risk mattered. At the moment this decision was made, the stakes were already unusually high. The career had been built on precision, carefully chosen roles, controlled public perception, and a reputation for reliability that studios trusted without hesitation. That reliability was not accidental. It was maintained through consistency, clarity, and a refusal to step into projects that couldn't be tightly managed. This project offered none of that. From the beginning, uncertainty was built into its foundation. The script was incomplete. Scenes were rewritten constantly. The director's process was famously opaque, favoring discovery over planning. Timelines were flexible to the point of abstraction. There was no clear sense of when the film would end, or what shape it would ultimately take. For an actor whose image depended on control, this was a direct challenge. The role itself was deceptively restrained. No grand transformation, no explosive arc, no clear heroism to anchor the narrative. Instead, it required vulnerability without reassurance, emotional exposure that was never rewarded with clarity or resolution. That kind of role doesn't generate instant goodwill. Audiences are comfortable with risk when it's framed as spectacle. They are far less comfortable when risk takes the form of ambiguity. And ambiguity is exactly what this film demanded, both from its audience and from the person at its center. The warnings came early. The shoot was taking too long. The secrecy was fueling rumors. The story was difficult to explain. Every delay amplified scrutiny. Every unanswered question created speculation. In an industry where momentum equals confidence, stalled momentum invites doubt. And doubt is dangerous at that level. The risk here wasn't about box office alone. It was about perception. Long absences raise questions. Projects that resist explanation invite misinterpretation. Working under a director who refused compromise meant surrendering influence at a point in a career where influence was expected. Most stars at this stage insulate themselves from that vulnerability. They choose projects with clear trajectories. They limit exposure. They manage narrative carefully. This choice did the opposite. It placed trust entirely in a process that offered no guarantees. The environment itself was isolating. Closed sets, minimal outside contact, an atmosphere that blurred professional and psychological boundaries. The work required not just performance, but endurance. Long stretches without feedback, reassurance, or context. That isolation compounds pressure. When there's no external frame of reference, doubt turns inward. Every decision feels magnified. Every scene carries the weight of unknown consequence. That kind of pressure doesn't just test craft. It tests identity. The character mirrored that instability. He moved through the story disoriented, reactive, unsure of his own position. Power shifted constantly. Certainty evaporated. Control was an illusion repeatedly exposed. This wasn't accidental. The narrative was designed to destabilize, not just the character, but the viewer. Living inside that destabilization for months at a time is not neutral. It seeps into rhythm, posture, and presence. It reshapes how a person occupies space. The work stops feeling like something you step into and out of. It becomes something you carry. The decision to stay, to commit fully despite delays, pressure, and mounting speculation, turned the project into a referendum on patience. Patience with process, patience with perception, patience with not knowing how the work would be received. That patience came at a cost. As the shoot extended, industry chatter grew louder. Was the project spiraling? Was the director pushing too far? Was this a mistake? The absence of information allowed narratives to form without resistance. In Hollywood, silence is rarely neutral. And yet, walking away was never a realistic option. Leaving would have validated the doubts. It would have reframed commitment as miscalculation. Staying meant enduring uncertainty, but preserving integrity. That trade-off defines the risk. The gamble wasn't that the film might fail. The gamble was that the process itself could alter how the actor was seen, less as a figure of control, more as a subject of speculation, less invincible, more exposed. Exposure is rarely rewarded immediately. This is why the decision stands out in hindsight. Not because it was reckless, but because it violated a pattern that had worked flawlessly for years. It replaced predictability with trust, control with surrender, certainty with endurance. Few stars at that level are willing to do that. Fewer still are willing to do it publicly, under sustained scrutiny, with no assurance of payoff. The film demanded something unusual: the willingness to be uncomfortable without resolution, to exist in a narrative that refuses closure, to accept that meaning would be inferred, debated, and possibly misunderstood. That demand extended beyond the screen. It affected how the project was discussed, how it was marketed, and how it would eventually be judged. There was no easy hook, no reassuring frame. The work resisted simplification at every level, which meant the risk continued even after production ended. This is where the phrase "risked everything" becomes precise rather than dramatic. It wasn't a single leap. It was a prolonged exposure to uncertainty, professional, psychological, and reputational. Most risks in Hollywood are calculated. This one was endured. And endurance changes things. As production stretched on, the risk stopped being theoretical and became lived experience. The schedule no longer felt delayed, it felt elastic. Weeks blurred into months. Scenes were revisited, reworked, and reinterpreted. Progress was measured not in pages completed, but in moments discovered. This was not a process designed for reassurance. The director's approach removed familiar anchors. There were no daily affirmations that things were working. No clear markers of completion. Scenes were filmed until something indefinable clicked. An atmosphere, a rhythm, a truth that could not be articulated in advance. For an actor used to precision, this was disorienting. Control is often invisible when it's present. It becomes noticeable only when it's taken away. Here, it was taken away, systematically. Choices that would normally be discussed openly were withheld. Motivations were suggested rather than explained. The work demanded intuition over certainty. Intuition, under pressure, is fragile. Every scene carried an unspoken question. Is this right, or simply unfinished? Without clarity, doubt has room to grow. And when doubt grows inside a closed environment, it intensifies. The relationship at the center of the film mirrored this dynamic. Trust was constantly tested. Power shifted unpredictably. Boundaries blurred. Certainty eroded. The narrative offered no firm ground, and neither did the process. That alignment between story and method was intentional, but intention does not eliminate strain. Living inside ambiguity for that long requires psychological stamina. It asks an actor to suspend judgment, not just of the character, but of the work itself. To keep showing up without knowing whether the path leads forward or circles back. That kind of endurance reframes risk. The danger was no longer failure. It was erosion. Erosion of confidence. Erosion of clarity. Erosion of the protective distance that usually separates role from self. The closed nature of the setting amplified this effect. Isolation is a powerful creative tool, but it also magnifies internal states. Without external reference points, the process becomes self-contained. The work defines reality. Doubt becomes personal. Rumors outside the production grew louder, as silence inside persisted. Industry withheld emotional payoff. The character's journey circled rather than resolved. Power dynamics remained unresolved. Meaning had to be inferred rather than delivered. That refusal unsettled viewers who expected clarity in exchange for attention. Critics split along similar lines. Some recognized the restraint as deliberate. Others saw it as alienating. The conversation quickly moved away from performance into interpretation. What the film meant, what it implied, and whether it justified its own opacity. In that shift, the risk sharpened. Because ambiguity invites projection. Viewers brought their own anxieties to the film, their own expectations of intimacy, morality, and control. When those expectations weren't met, dissatisfaction followed. The work did not accommodate comfort. This is where the reputational gamble peaked. At this point in a career, deviation carries outsized consequences. Films are not judged in isolation. They are read as statements. Choices are interpreted as signals, and this signal was clear. Comfort was not the priority. That signal confused people. Why step away from proven formulas? Why accept a role defined by uncertainty? Why remain inside a project that refused to explain itself? The answer wasn't immediate success. It was integrity of process. The film's reception did not provide instant validation. Instead, it initiated a slow recalibration. Conversations evolved over time. Initial reactions softened. Reviewings altered perception. What first appeared distant began to feel intentional. Time became the film's ally. As distance from the hype grew, the work was reassessed on its own terms. The restraint once criticized as coldness began to read as discipline. The lack of resolution emerged as thematic rather than evasive. The film's emotional austerity aligned with its psychological focus. This reevaluation revealed something important about the risk. The danger wasn't that the film would fail. The danger was that it would be misunderstood. And misunderstanding, at that scale, lingers. For Tom Cruise, the aftermath required patience. Not the patience of waiting for box office numbers, but the patience of letting interpretation evolve. The work couldn't be defended easily without violating its own intent. Explanation would have diminished it. Silence, again, became part of the commitment. That silence allowed the film to age without interference, to find its audience gradually, to shift from controversy to case study, from expectation to examination. In hindsight, this is where the risk fully crystallized. Most careers at this level avoid ambiguity because ambiguity threatens brand coherence. This choice fractured that coherence deliberately. It introduced uncertainty where certainty had been the asset. That fracture didn't break the career, but it changed its trajectory. It expanded what was possible afterward. It demonstrated a willingness to prioritize process over perception, meaning over momentum. That signal mattered to collaborators, even if it confused audiences at first. The film became a dividing line. Before it, the image was defined by control. After it, the image included surrender. That surrender wasn't weakness. It was selectivity. It showed that not every project needed to reinforce dominance. That vulnerability could exist without spectacle. That ambiguity could be embraced without explanation. Those lessons don't show up on opening weekend. They emerge over time. This is why the risk is still discussed. Not because the film shocked, but because it resisted easy placement. It refused to behave like a star vehicle. It treated its lead not as a stabilizing force, but as a subject within a larger psychological system. That inversion unsettled expectations. And expectation is where most backlash lives. The film didn't betray its audience. It challenged them. Challenge is often mistaken for failure when audiences are primed for reward. But reward was never the currency here. Engagement was. The engagement continues. Decades later, the film is revisited not for its plot, but for its atmosphere, for its restraint, for its willingness to remain unresolved. It invites interpretation rather than consensus. That endurance reframes the risk once more. The gamble wasn't on reception, it was on longevity. Longevity favors work that resists exhaustion. Work that doesn't give everything away at once. Work that trusts viewers to meet it halfway. This trust is rare in mainstream cinema. It requires confidence not just in craft, but in audience curiosity. It requires accepting that not everyone will follow, and that those who do may arrive slowly. That acceptance defines the risk. By choosing this project, the actor stepped into a space where approval was uncertain and misunderstanding was likely. The safety nets were removed. The usual defenses, charisma, momentum, narrative clarity, were intentionally minimized. What remained was exposure. Exposure to process, exposure to ambiguity, exposure to time. And time ultimately proved decisive. The film's place in the canon solidified not through unanimity but through persistence. It survived debate, it outlasted dismissal, it continues to provoke without demanding resolution. That is the mark of a risk that paid off differently, not with immediate validation, but with lasting relevance. With enough distance, the real risk of Eyes Wide Shut becomes clearer, and it has very little to do with controversy, box office, or critical division. The true risk was structural. It challenged the foundation on which a global career had been carefully built. For years, success had been reinforced by momentum. Projects moved quickly. Narratives were clear. Control was visible. The public image was coherent, deliberate, and nearly unshakable. This film disrupted that rhythm by introducing stillness, opacity, and surrender. Surrender is the part most people underestimate. It's easy to talk about risk when it involves spectacle, stunts, physical danger, public confrontation. But surrendering control inside an industry that rewards certainty is a quieter, deeper gamble. It strips away insulation. It removes the ability to steer perception. And it leaves reputation exposed to forces that cannot be managed in real time. That exposure is what made this choice exceptional. The project demanded patience without reward, trust without feedback, and commitment without reassurance. It asked for endurance rather than momentum. And endurance, unlike momentum, does not generate applause. The film's ambiguity was not a flaw to be corrected. It was the point. It mirrored the instability of the character's world and the fragility of certainty itself. That mirror extended beyond the screen. The process forced everyone involved to exist inside unresolved tension. For months, then years. Few stars at this level accept that condition voluntarily. Most protect themselves from it. What makes this decision endure is that it was not a rebellion against success. It was an interrogation of it. The film asked what happens when privilege, power, and confidence collide with vulnerability that offers no redemption arc. It questioned identity rather than affirming it. That question was uncomfortable for audiences and risky for someone whose career thrived on assurance. The aftermath proved how rare that gamble was. Instead of immediate consensus, the film produced long-term debate. Instead of clarity, it generated interpretation. Instead of reinforcement, it introduced complexity into a previously streamlined image. Complexity doesn't always pay dividends quickly, but it reshapes legacy. Over time, the choice came to represent something larger than the film itself. It signaled that even at the peak of control, there was room to relinquish it deliberately. That risk was not about losing status. It was about refusing to let status dictate creative boundaries. This reframes the idea of risking everything. Everything wasn't money. Everything wasn't popularity. Everything was identity. The identity of being infallible, predictable, always in command. Stepping away from that identity, even briefly, creates vulnerability. Vulnerability invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites misinterpretation. And misinterpretation can calcify into reputation if left unchallenged. The film accepted that possibility. It did not rush to correct the narrative. It allowed silence to do the work. Silence can be dangerous, but it can also be clarifying. Over time, it let the film stand without explanation, without apology, without defensive framing. That restraint is rare. It suggests confidence not in reception, but in intent. Looking back, the decision didn't derail a career. It expanded its perimeter. It proved that control could be relinquished without collapse. That ambiguity could coexist with longevity. That not every project needed to serve the same function. The lesson here is not that risk is always rewarded. It's that meaningful risk changes the questions being asked. Before this film, the question was how high the ceiling could go. After it, the question became how wide the range could stretch. That shift matters. It opens space for contradiction, for reinvention, for work that doesn't need to justify itself through scale or speed. The film remains divisive because it refuses to settle. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't reassure. It doesn't resolve. And that refusal is precisely why it continues to matter. For an industry built on certainty, this choice demonstrated that uncertainty can be a deliberate artistic position, not a failure of planning, but a commitment to complexity. The risk paid off slowly, not through unanimous praise, but through persistence, through continued discussion, through reinterpretation, through survival in a cultural landscape that quickly discards work that exhausts itself. Eyes Wide Shut never exhausts itself. And that endurance is the final proof that the gamble was not reckless, but principled. It showed that sometimes the most dangerous thing a star can do is step out of alignment with expectation, to trust a process that cannot be explained, to allow work to remain unresolved, and to accept that not being immediately understood is not the same as being wrong. That acceptance is rare at any level. At the highest level, it is almost unheard of, which is why this decision still stands as one of the most revealing moments of the career. Not because it shocked, but because it stripped away certainty and survived anyway. If this story changed how you think about risk, control, and why some of the most important career decisions don't look brave in the moment, stay with the channel. Here, we explore the hidden turning points behind iconic films, where reputation, identity, and creativity collide in ways audiences rarely see. Subscribe for more deep, documentary-style breakdowns of legendary roles, controversial choices, and the quiet risks that redefine Hollywood careers. And if there's another film or actor whose strangest choice deserves this level of analysis, share it in the comments. Because sometimes the greatest risk isn't failing publicly. It's choosing uncertainty when success feels guaranteed.